The size of the problems that you solve determines the size of the opportunities that you're able to capture into the future. My name is Fari, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through the three levels of problem solving, how I'm basically thinking about this, and how I'm implementing it inside Killer Chaos OS, which is our own internal operating system that governs how we're basically able to build backend infrastructure. So, every business, every system, every career path boils down to one thing, which is your ability to solve problems. And I think this simple concept of saying, hey, we need to ultimately understand, our ability to solve problems basically allows us to say, hey, if we're going to be solving problems and we're going to be going through, this chief problem solver mode, we need to make sure that we are building a mental OS, or we understanding, the types of levels of problem solving that we need to do. And ultimately also understanding that, hey, problem solving is just not one thing after the other. We need to have more structure around this to say, hey, what is the unique angle that I could reposition my view specifically on problem solving. And this is exactly what I did, to say, hey, here's my unique angle from my experiences, to say, hey, problem solving has shaped how I've been able to think, and also governed in the sense that, hey, I've been able to build these mental models and frameworks simply because I understand that every business, every system, and every career path boils down to this one simple thing, which is your ability to solve problems. And through that, you need to understand that, hey, not all problems are equal, and not all problems are also worth solving. And I think for me, when I was probably starting out, my main thing was I need to solve all the problems. I need to be the chief problem solver, solving all of these different problems. But as I grow up and as I get more skin in the game, I realize that not all problems are equal, and not all problems are worth solving. And how do I basically take an approach, is the question that I ask myself, to say, how do I basically take an approach that ultimately allows me to rank them into three different levels, to say, hey, this is the low level and this is the high level problems that we need to solve. Because some of them may be masked, and you may think that, hey, this problem is super urgent, and it ultimately moves the needle, but in actual fact it does not. And this is why I basically took this universal, or this overview, to say, hey, how can I basically break down problems into three different levels, by having the surface level problems as number one, and number two, the structural problems, the bottlenecks, and also moving to the systemic, or the systemic problems, sorry about that, the problems, the multipliers. And ultimately understanding that, hey, when we take a look at the surface level problems, these are the problems that are urgent but not important. And an example of this is basically looking at, hey, we have a broken website, we need to fix it. 100% sure that it is necessary for the business's operational needs, but ultimately it's not transformative. And understanding that, hey, this it seems urgent and we need to get it done today, but ultimately it does not ultimately transform anything within the business. We can get it done today, but ultimately it does not move the needle. If we're making like a small tweak or just one of these things, we need to basically be able to understand that, hey, this surface level problem, which is basically noise, I like to say, is ultimately one thing that seems important, but it ultimately is not. It does not move the needle in whatsoever form, even though it looks like it. And then ultimately understanding that, hey, there's another level to this, which is the structural problems. And these are basically bottlenecks. And like I always say, your bottlenecks or your constraints, you only move as fast as them. So basically solving them as soon as possible allows you to move a lot quicker. And solely just understanding that, hey, we need to be able to understand, what is noise and what are the bottleneck problems that we're ultimately going to be facing, because these are, your constraints that ultimately slow your growth. And ultimately understanding that, hey, with these constraints that we're facing, maybe on a weekly basis or monthly basis, we need to be able to ultimately be able to solve them, because they ultimately stop growth. And understanding that growth is one of these things that we need to just, always incorporate, whether it's just mentally or physically, in terms of what we're actively building out. We need to make sure that we're growing in each and every single facet of our lives as well. And also me, I always try to be the person that is a lifelong learner, to always make sure that each and every single day. I'm learning as much as possible, and there are times, where you ultimately come across bottlenecks. Let's say you're reading a book, and then ultimately, it's a new concept, you don't understand what is going on, and then ultimately saying, hey, this is a constraint, this is a bottleneck, how can I fix this? You can go on YouTube, listen to an audiobook of that specific section, and then that makes more sense. Ultimately being able to understand, hey, this is a bottleneck that is ultimately slowing my growth because I can't finish the book, and understanding that, hey, because I can't finish the book, I can't get new ideas that I can ultimately deploy into the business. And I think this is one of the main things as well, to ultimately understand that there are structural problems where you're ultimately able to say, hey, we need to understand that there are surface level problems, and then there are structural problems that we need to solve, and then having an overview or an oversight in terms of how to combat that as well. And an example of this can be a business that leads, basically saying, hey, a business that has leads but ultimately no follow-up system, so basically they're unable to follow up on those leads. They just have this data pool of leads that they have, but ultimately they're not doing anything with it, and that ultimately leads to revenue leaks daily, solely because they can't reach out to those leads because they don't have that infrastructure built. And through that could even be something as simple as an email sequence, to say, hey, we have this email sequence where we get an email and then we constantly just nurture them, just sending them promotional things that we're doing, and ultimately that gets them to buy your thing. Ultimately, by not having this is ultimately a constraint, but one of the things is, it's not a constraint until you see it, and once you see it, you definitely cannot unsee it. And I think this this revenue leak is ultimately something that happens daily, simply because you have this massive data pool of clients, and you don't check up on them. For example, you don't have a post consultation follow-up sequence where you basically following up to say, hey, did you enjoy your process, or how was your experience, how would you rate your experience? Simply because of that ultimately compounds through time, and making sure that, hey, we want people to come back, and how do we basically build this system that ultimately allows us to be able to bring people back, because it's more expensive most of the case, from my experience, to spend more money to acquire new people, rather than just keeping the people that you have and get them to pay you recurring, for example, or just simply just tapping into your data pool already. If you've serviced one person, what can you do to possibly make them come back? Do you have any surface level, or do you have any structural systems that you can ultimately build that ultimately allows you to make them keep coming back? And I think this is one of those things that ultimately needs to be understood, to say, hey, we need to make sure that we're ultimately solving these in order to create leverage, because understanding that these problems, they're faced by many businesses, but they ultimately, some of them don't even know that they exist, simply because they're just too stuck in their minds, probably, if you say, in what they're doing, and it seems like everything's working, but like I said, it's one of those things that you don't realize until you actively see, hey, we're spending so much acquiring new people when we could have just simply spent this on just nurturing and getting our people to buy from us once and twice and three times and however many times, because simply through that ultimately brings in a lot more. And then understanding that the third layer to this is ultimately systemic problems, and by this is ultimately the multipliers. Basically, these are the ones that shape the entire trajectory, so these are the problems that ultimately scale, and these simply problems ultimately need to be understood at a much deeper level. And also understanding that, hey, example of this is shifting a company's model from a once-off service to a recurring revenue service based model, and ultimately understanding that, hey, this is a massive shift from us moving to a once-off to now a recurring. We're gonna have to move our billing structures, and also the way that we nurture our clients, to say, hey, we're gonna have to rethink and reimagine how we're actively seeing the onboarding flow to post consultation flow, I like to say. And ultimately understanding that these problems are ultimately the cause of the entire trajectory of the business, and how we're able to understand them problem from a deep core, first principles basis, to say, hey, we understand it from its core, and we need to also understand how each and every single moving part may interact into the future, because that ultimately gives us control. And with that control, we're then able to build into the future. And then understanding that, hey, solving here doesn't just fix the issue, it ultimately reshapes the playing field. And this is the quadrant that most people, especially in my experience nowadays, that they focus a lot more on the problems that ultimately multiply, to say, hey, what are the decisions that I need to wake up today that ultimately multiply the trajectory of the business. And simply through that, they're able to 10x whatever output they were able to do, simply because they focus a lot more on these specific problems the ultimately multiply. And through these multiplying problems, you ultimately are able to scale beyond your leverage, beyond what you would have done if it was a surface level problem or a structural problem. And through understanding this has ultimately made me realize that a lot more time needs to be spent in the multiplying segment, to say, hey, how can we multiply our impact and what we're able to do. And understanding that the problems that I want to be solving mainly need to be more centered around what actively multiplies, because what actively multiplies ultimately creates a lot more value and allows a lot more service to a lot more people as well, rather than saying, hey, I'm focusing on the surface level task, the mundane task of saying, hey, we need to make tweaks on a website and we need to do all these things. Sure, like that would be seeming important at that present moment in time, but ultimately it's not the problem worth solving that ultimately scales. And I think most people stay stuck solving the surface level problems because these are ultimately just noise. And I think once you realize and you start moving from surface level problems, then you move through structural problems, then you move to the one that creates most leverage out of these three, which is ultimately the multipliers. You're then able to understand that, hey, I need to actively be spending more time in this specific quadrant, because this is what actively scales my level of impact, not only for me but also for my clients as well, to say, hey, the real opportunity is in training yourself to identify and operate in the structural and systemic levels, and ultimately understanding that, hey, we need to make sure that we're focusing on the system side and making sure that each and every single day that we're focusing on the two quadrants, which is the structural problems and the multipliers as well. See how I didn't say this word? I know. I know. Yeah, so ultimately saying, hey, that's where outsized impacts and returns come from. Because in the end, ultimately understanding that the size of your problems you solve ultimately determines the size of the opportunities that you can capture. And if you can solve the problems within number two, which is the structural and also the systemic or multipliers, you ultimately able to scale your level of impact into the future. And a lot of people get stuck in the surface level problems, and ultimately I was in that phase too. Then I realized that, hey, all the problems may seem like they need to be solved, but ultimately they don't create as much leverage as focusing on the multipliers. What actively multiplies my level of impact, I need to spend more time focusing on that. And now on a day-to-day basis, like I've reshaped the way I've been able to think. I've said, hey, like I've taken the hit, that's okay to focus on surface level problems at a specific stage. But now that you're moving, you ultimately need to grow into a person that focuses on the bottlenecks and also the multipliers, and solely just identifying that, which I'll probably make in a video on how to actively just identify, or how I actively think in terms of identifying it and ultimately scaling that into the future. And I know we're gonna get so many things wrong, but ultimately each and every single day we're just gonna keep moving the needle forward and just solely just understanding from my mistakes, like me trying to pronounce systemic problems. That's so funny. But yeah, ultimately through that we're ultimately just going to be able to learn from our mistakes and ultimately just build better into the future, so that we get to the grand vision of Killer Chaos OS, where we're redefining industries, scaling the level of impact that we have, and then most importantly inspiring millions of people. And I think that is a future worth getting excited for, and saying, hey, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to make sure that that we're building this future because that excites me, and I think that we're gonna get a lot further than we could ever imagine simply by just taking these daily actions that allow us to push our level of impact forward into the future. So I'm super excited. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.